one of the most fascinating books in my personal library is The Pink Swastika, Homosexuality in the Nazi Party. You want to talk about a politically incorrect book? Well, this is it. The left-wing activists in the news media don't want you to know that the Nazi Party was officially the National Socialist Party. They weren't right-wingers. They were far left-wingers. And the socialists and their apologists in the news media also don't want you to know about how deeply the Nazi Party was infested with occultism and homosexuality, two things that appear before a nation implodes. Well, The Pink Swastika was published in 1995. I think I bought my first copy, I'm thinking sometime maybe the year 2000. We started the program in 1999, so it was sometime in that period. And it was an eye-opener for me. And I remember clearly when the Holy Spirit gave me a reading list. It wasn't by the books, but it was by topics. And I was in prayer, and the Lord just gave me this list of topics that he wanted me to study. And one of them was Nazism. And I wrote down the whole list that I was hearing in my spirit as I was praying, and I began to search for books on those subjects, and that's how I came across The Pink Swastika. And I was shocked at what I learned about Hitler and the top Nazis, and I said, they lied to me in school and college. They never told me any of this stuff. The media has never told me any of this. All they've told us is that they were right-wingers, and they weren't right-wingers. They were gay, left-wing socialists. Imagine that. Well, the book was co-authored by Dr. Scott Lively and Kevin Abrams. And Dr. Lively is on the telephone. He is an ardent defender of the traditional family, and his website is defendthefamily.com. Dr. Lively, welcome to True News.
Oh, it's so very good to be here. I believed that the Nazis were anti-homosexual, and I was the spokesman for a ballot measure campaign in Oregon when I encountered this information for the first time. We had introduced a ballot measure that would have changed the Oregon Constitution and stopped the homosexual agenda cold. And I was the spokesman for that, the communications director for the Oregon Citizens Alliance. And the opposition campaign was based on the theme that people who oppose gay rights are like the Nazis. And that was, we were hammered with that for 2 solid years. All the media, the governor, the activists that flooded in from all over the world to oppose us. And one day, this guy came into my office, and he was sort of a wild-eyed sort of a guy, and he had this sheaf of handwritten notes, and he said, "They got it all wrong. The Nazis were homosexuals," and you know, I thought the guy was a kook, and you know, I nodded politely and took the papers and stuck them in a file. Didn't really do anything. We went through that whole election cycle, and then in the next election cycle, we lost. We revived the campaign and a whole series of city and county initiatives. And when we got to the Marion County where we were, the opposition leader revived that campaign, that people who oppose gay rights are like the Nazis. And he wrote a letter to the local newspapers saying he just returned from Dachau, what an amazing similarity there was between the OCA and the Nazis. And I said, I've had enough. I went and dug up these papers out of my files, read them for the first time, and my jaw hit the desk. Because these were direct quotations from mainstream history books, William Shirer, Conrad Hayden, and others, stuff that had been published from the 40s through the 60s, and that was the beginning of this book. And I went on and did hundreds more hours of research and compiled what's now 400 pages of documentation on this theme in the Pink Swastika, which is now in its 4th edition.
Okay, let's start with the Fuhrer himself. Did he have sexual identity problems?
Well, Hitler was what I would call a pansexualist. He wasn't exclusively a homosexual, not in the sense of just being attracted to people of the same sex. There are at least 4 women that we know of that he had sex with, It was a very perverted form of sexuality. All four of them tried to commit suicide, two of them succeeded. It seems that his primary emphasis was extreme form of masochism called coprophilia, which involves human excrement. It's completely disgusting. And I think that the homosexual culture that he lived in and that homosexual relationship that he maintained with his whole inner circle was really sort of a less perverse identity than the one that he would have opted for if he'd had the chance. The person that's probably the closest to Hitler's profile in terms of sexual perversion is Alfred Kinsey, the guy that really launched the sexual revolution here in America.
Mm-hmm.
He was an in-the-closet gay activist, but he spent all of his time indulging himself in every kind of wickedness that you can think of. And Hitler did pretty much that as well, but there was less opportunity there in Germany.
Kinsey, in his experiments, he actually had little children who were molested as part of his scientific experiments.
Yes. Now, some of those were actually the children of I think it was the Buchenwald concentration camp, and that the person who did those experiments, many of them, was one of the Krupps, who had a sort of a children's division of the concentration camp, and he messed with all those kids there. And people don't understand that the Kinsey Institute that exists today, they've got the old German records. People don't know that the gay movement did not start here in the United States. It started in Germany in the 1860s, and it came to full fruition as a movement by the 1920s in Germany. It was the reason for the moral disintegration of that country and the rise of Nazism, and the whole inner circle of Adolf Hitler was homosexual. But it's really interesting because Hitler's faction were masculine-oriented, butch homosexual men. And the ones that the Nazis later did persecute, there were quite a number of them, nowhere near in the millions. It was maybe the tens of thousands. But their enemies were the effeminate branch of the German gay subculture, which actually got started first. It was Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, the founder of the feminist branch of the male gay movement, that really launched the whole thing. It's one of his friends that coined the term homosexual. It didn't exist before Ulrichs' group. And he created a group called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in order to try to create a political movement to overturn the sodomy laws of Germany. And but he had a theory that all male homosexuals were really females trapped in men's bodies, and lesbians were really men trapped in female bodies, and then he called that the third sex theory. So what he was basically saying is that all homosexual men are really women, and the masculine-oriented butch homosexuals hated this guy because they were not feminine at all. They were even ultra-masculine, and so these two factions warred against each other for a long time. And then when the Nazis really formed together and wanted to pursue political control of the state, they created the Nazi Party, and almost all the early Nazis were homosexual, almost all of them, and they began going for parliamentary seats. Well, the effeminate homosexuals were aligned with the Communist Party, and they were the homosexuals among the communists were grounded in the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, which was Germany's version of the Kinsey Institute, and by this time, Ulrichs was long dead. Magnus Hirschfeld was the head of this Sex Research Institute of Berlin, which everybody that got arrested for sex crimes was sent to this institute for therapy, right? Which was being run by these effeminate homosexual men. And so what would happen, though, is that these effeminate gays affiliated with the communists, whenever there was an election and the Nazis were trying to get parliamentary seats, they would release information to the newspapers about the homosexuality of the Nazis and sabotage them. So they had this intense hatred of the femmes. And so as soon as Hitler came to power in 1933, one of the first acts of his control was to send the brown shirts over and to take over the Sex Research Institute of Berlin, to go in there, take control of the building, kick everybody out, steal all those files, which was all the incriminating evidence. That was May 6, 1933. 4 days later, May 10th, 1933, they put them all in a big giant bonfire and set it on fire. And then they were stood out there throwing Thomas Mann's books and other things in there to make it look like it was something else. But that famous image of the book burning,
Mm-hmm.
that was the records of the Sex Research Institute of Berlin. And it was the assistant director of the institute that exposed, that came out publicly saying the reason they're doing this is because that's all the records that show that these guys were arrested for perversion. It's amazing stuff.
They threw books in as the political cover for the giant fire.
Right.
And today, the only thing teachers and professors talk about in school and colleges is the Nazis burned books.
Yes, that's it. It's amazing deception that they engaged in this, and almost nobody knows this stuff.
Well, this explains why Hitler and the Nazis were going after the communists, because
yes.
Hitler was a socialist, so why would he go to war with the communists?
Well, they called the brown shirts beefsteak, brown on the outside, red on the inside. And they actually copied. The Nazis really copied the communists in many of their tactics. It was the communists that were doing sort of, beating people up and stuff for a long time. The Bolsheviks had, that's how they had taken over Russia. In fact, the first concentration camps weren't in Germany; they were in Russia, and the Nazis were basically just following the example of the model that had been set. So they were just a counterfaction. They were a splinter off of the communists.
Hitler, as a young man, he was a student of Madame Blavatsky. He was deeply involved in the occult.
All this happened when he was a street kid, basically.
Mm-hmm.
He left his home. He didn't have any place to go. He was on the streets in Germany, mostly in Munich and Vienna, and he was as a street kid with no place to go. He was trying to make it as an artist, and that was the perfect recipe to sort of be swept up into gay culture. And I don't know who introduced him. That isn't, he never confessed to any of this stuff or wrote about it himself. It's all sort of secondary evidence and other sources, people who are saying that they had sex with Hitler or whatever. But what we do know is that he became a male prostitute in Munich and Vienna.
Hitler was a male prostitute?
Yes. And he lived in a flop house for, that was primarily a home for street hustlers. And that's how he met many of these people, including Ernst Röhm, who was really the power behind the throne in Germany.
What took place in the 20s and early 30s?
Well, the beginning of the Butch faction was in 1902. Hans Bleuer formed the Gemeinschaft der Eigenen, the community of the elite, and they were sort of chafing against this characterization of male homosexuals as women. And so they created this separate identity. They reached back to ancient Greek culture, specifically the Spartans, for a sort of model to follow. And then they began promoting this sort of hyper-masculine form of homosexuality throughout Germany. They gained control of the German Wandervogel movement, which is like the German version of the Boy Scouts. And by 1912, they were in complete control of that.
But that's what they're doing here, Dr. Lively. That's what they're doing in America. They're infiltrating the Boy Scouts.
Yeah, they're trying to. They've resisted it pretty much here. But in Germany, they were completely taken over. In fact, a group had to split off away from them in order to have a separate form of Boy Scouts that wasn't under homosexual control. But the real important fact here is that what they were doing was inculcating in these children the philosophy of the Männerbund, the all-male society.